It's great to be with all of you, and I want to commend the CED because they have managed today, everything I've been to, there's an Ex-Im Bank giant conference today with a few thousand people. I just came from the Atlantics Forum on the economy with people, and we've got the New America Foundation conference and this, and they're all at the same time. So we're going to see each other at all of these things, moving around today, right? We've got an outstanding panel to discuss the political scene. Just to my right with Newsmax, we have Bob Walker, former congressman. We have Jeanne Cummings, who's a political reporter with Bloomberg. I have one of her colleagues on stage right now over at the Hilton. We have Michelle Cottle, who's a Washington correspondent, great political correspondent, a colleague I often run into in the MSNBC green room, but with National Journal, and she's in the Atlantic media family. We have Matt Schlapp, who's the founder of Cove Strategies and the chairman of the American Conservative Union, and a great friend, Margaret Taleb of Bloomberg also. So we can really kind of do it all here. Why even have an election? We can just sort it out with the folks that we have here. We decide how to handicap it, and it will come out this way. But it occurs to me, just to sort of open things up, maybe on the Republican side of things, Koch Industries is one of the underwriters of the forum today, one of several of the Atlantic Forum, and Larry Summers gave us a bit of heat. He was speaking on the stage, and I said, we've achieved in sort of at least a new moment when Larry Summers would go onto a stage that Koch had in part paid for, and I don't know who's going to take bigger, but Koch has also come out, the Koch brothers have also said, here are 5 people we could live with. After basically having one slip saying that Scott Walker. So I'm just going to start with you, Matt, and say, what do you think about the Koch 5? And what would be the ACU 5 from your perspective? I think maybe you just kick it. And
just talk through it?
Yeah, go ahead.
That worked? Okay. Wow, this is really good technology. I'm trying to filibuster that question, actually, so I'm just trying to think. No, I think, look, there's no question that we have, in essence, broken our campaign finance system, and we keep thinking that we're going to purify politics. Guess what? That's not possible. Democracies are messy, and people have a right to spend their money, and so we somehow have come up with a system where people can now spend all their money through nonprofits. Mostly the Freedom Partners is the C6, there are C4s, there are super PACs, and I don't know why that was any better than giving a whole bunch of money to the DNC and the RNC and these other entities, but that's where we are. So now you have these kingpins on the outside who have conferences that are in rooms much like this room, and I don't get invited to many of those because my wallet is much thinner than I think many of the people who are there. And look, I think I respect people on the left and the right that spend their money as they want in politics. I just think there's a consequence for Republicans, as a proud Republican, a conservative Republican. There are consequences for our candidates going around to all of these well-heeled donors and trying to get their favor. This used to be done in a lot more discreet fashion, and it ain't so discreet anymore. And I gotta wonder what Joe Sixpack thinks out there in the country. If I'm an activist in Iowa or New Hampshire, I still hope that person is more influential than any millionaire who wants to write a big check. So of the 5, all I would say is that I think our field is big, and it's a lot broader than 5, and people might be surprised who gets this nomination. It might not be one of those 5.
Yeah, I think, at last count, I saw 18 potential GOP candidates. Bob, is there a Bob Walker 5?
No, but it was interesting the other day that Larry Sabato came down with 4, in which he said it was Bush, Walker, Rubio, and Kasich were the people that he put in the 4. So there are, a variety of people trying to sort out the 20 people. And the fact is that the real sorting out process will come, first of all, in who decides that they're actually going to run in Iowa. So, and then what happens in Iowa, because it's possible that the winner of Iowa will only get 15, 16, 17% of the vote, and it won't have the momentum coming out of Iowa that typically has been the case.
So do you all remember the Coke and Pepsi tests that you'd be blindfolded and you have to see what's Coke and what's Pepsi? So let's get out.
You're talking about a different Coke.
What's that?
A different Coke.
Yeah, that's right, a different Coke. I wasn't even thinking about that. But let's take the Coke Pepsi test here in a sense of getting rid of the names for a minute, of getting away from the personality issues. And asking, what do you think are the distinctive It's a crowded marketplace for GOP presidential aspirants. It's a crowded market. What do you think are the biggest issues of differentiation, Michelle?
Well, I kind of believe in my soul that it needs to be a governor. I understand that Rubio is very popular. You got a lot of senators out there jockeying for this.
A governor that
I think the executive experience,
chief
the governor
executive.
distance from this very unpopular, very dysfunctional Congress. So, I think just kind of structurally, we need a chief executive to be kind of the nominee for the party. But I don't know in terms of issues, kind of what's going to dominate. Jeb Bush is on Common Core and immigration heretical, but I've talked to plenty of conservative Republicans who say if he kind of, not fudges, but finds a way to make clear that he understands their issues, that wouldn't necessarily kill him. So, it is a huge field, and it will be interesting to see kind of what floats as a key test.
Jeanne, how do you handicap it?
I think that the 5 that have been discussed are probably the ones that are going to fight it out. And as a consequence...
Fight now and knock each other out? Or,
yeah. And I'd put...
So there's another wave?
No, I think other than Kasich maybe coming in late, and then the late announcements that we've got, we already know are coming. I think we're looking at the field. I think I'd put Rand in as a contender. Not most likely to win. But as a consequence, when you look at those personalities, they'll try to kill Rand with foreign policy, so that will become a major issue. If Christie gets in, they'll try to kill him with Social Security, since he rolled out his plan and is then forcing the rest to talk about it when they don't want to, so they need to knock him off to get rid of the issue. So, I think that's when you ask about what are the issues going to be, obviously they're going to try to kill Bush with immigration. So I think it's just going to be driven by the political tactics and not necessarily a big debate that America wants to have.
Let me push you a little bit on the foreign policy side with Rand Paul for a minute, because I've read all of his foreign policy speeches closely, and while many people have this image of him as a harsh libertarian, he regularly says, I don't hold an isolationist view. I hold a realist view, a much more of a Nixonian realist view. But I think we need to be cautious of intervention. And at least in the old Republican Party, that used to dominate. That used to be the sort of defining feature of GOP conservative foreign policy. And so, do you think people are hearing through the noise, seeing through the frame, that actually he's trying to put a different foreign policy in place and that people aren't reading it? Or do you think the Republican Party has just rejected completely the old foreign policy perspectives that say a Nixon or even a George H.W. Bush would have represented?
I'll make a quick comment, and then I'm going to pass you over to Margaret, who is a foreign policy expert, unlike me. But I do think that there is gray in what Rand Paul is saying, and I do think Rand Paul, on many issues, is trying to carve out what is a realistic position, and not necessarily a partisan position or a new one or an old one, but something he thinks is workable in the current environment. That all said, gray doesn't play well in a primary fight that's going to be as sharp as this one.
Margaret, to you.
Well, I guess I have a couple thoughts. One is that the more pro-interventionist bent has come at a time when President Obama is the president, and these Republican candidates or hopefuls are reacting or sort of pre-acting against a sitting president from the opposite party who they know they can criticize. I think when they are the candidates, or if the president were a Republican, they would come at it from a different perspective kind of right out of the gate. So I think that's just one thing to keep in mind. And another is that there are some third rails in American politics, no matter which party you're in, and one of them is protecting Israel. And if you're a Republican candidate who's seriously seeking the nomination for president, even if your heart comes from a sort of less hawkish or less all-in approach, there are a couple places where you need to make clear that you're willing to kind of slide, and Israel is one of those. And I think Paul has said as much himself. I mean, he's said, look, we can't, sort of save everybody, but you have to start with who your allies are. And that's the position that he's always come at it from. So I think it's hard to look at how his position has modified or how his rhetoric has modified on Israel and take much more of a broader takeaway from it, because it really is sort of Israel specific.
Right. And Jean's completely right that nuance doesn't play. I mean, I was at a breakfast with Mike Lee,
Right.
And he was lamenting that his good friend Rand, on the day he announced, had just been already slammed with attack ads about how he was to the left of Obama on foreign policy. Now, that's completely exaggerating the situation and completely inaccurate, but that's the sort of thing that's going to happen to him. It's just reductionist is what happens.
So let's jump to the big Democratic field, Bob. Can you handicap the contenders for us?
Well, it's interesting. The Republicans have an extremely strong bench, and the Democrats don't have much of a bench at all this time, which I think has moved Hillary Clinton to announce faster than she would have otherwise announced. I think that the momentum of not having a bench has moved her along to a point where she had to come out probably sooner than she really wanted to. If for whatever reason she ends up faltering along the way, they don't have very much of a fallback position.
So does she have a trade problem? She sort of seems to be intimating that there's some distance between the new Hillary and the former Hillary on things like trade, and the fact that her husband essentially was the anointed king of globalization, the sort of, high trust globalization that was sort of delivering these things. Hillary is compared to that, but Hillary's got this real, I've got Mike Froman over at our other conference today, and I'm talking about this, about the fact that you have this really interesting, nasty feud going on in the Democratic Party. Elizabeth Warren is really raising, Martin O'Malley is pushing all these. A lot of governors. Harry Reid has come out and said never would he support these trade deals. Yeah, hell no. And so, how much of a challenge is it? Even though there doesn't seem to be a contender to Hillary, doesn't she have a kind of informal primary going on right now?
I would say that Obama is doing her a huge favor, because this is going to be gone. She's got to ride out the next month or so, and it is a big fight. It's a legitimate fight inside their party, just as the fights inside of the Republican Party are real, and it will come back up. But she's not going to have an opponent that can exploit that particular issue. The one thing I would say, though, is I think if Jim Webb hangs around long enough to get on the debate stage with Hillary Clinton, then she's going to face some very tough moments, because Jim Webb is as smart as she is on foreign policy, and he doesn't agree with her, and he does not think she performed well, and he will say so in blunt terms. And so if there could be some surprises if Webb in particular stays. Webb also is actually very authentic on the issue of income inequality. And so that voice that we won't have through Elizabeth Warren, we could well have through Webb. He won't have a big megaphone, but all he needs are a few debates, and Hillary Clinton could face some tough moments.
Can I jump in here just for a second? If she falters was kind of in the question. Let's be clear. She has faltered. Now, she improved as a candidate tremendously in 2008, and I think we'll see that again. But she has faltered already. We all know this. Democrats are worried. She's not going to, if this is the way she's going to run for president, this is not going to go well. This trade issue, it is not going away. The fact is this: yes, I'm a conservative Republican. The base of her party is just not in love with her. They are in love with Elizabeth Warren. That is who they listen to. Why isn't Elizabeth Warren coming out and saying how great Hillary Clinton is? She's saying she's not running for president. I don't hear her saying anything much positive. By the way, I don't hear Barack Obama saying much positive. I don't see him embracing this right now. I know that supposedly this is his candidate. I think she's got.
I would challenge that.
Okay, but
I
just think
she's got the leadership there, and I think Warren will probably be one of the first to endorse her.
Then why did I think that's a big deal. All I'm saying is it hasn't happened, and you haven't seen much warmth. And on the email question, you certainly seem to see some hostility with the administration. So I just think for Republicans, yes, we have a big field.
I think the president will come out at some point and say that Hillary's quite likable.
Absolutely.
I think we can probably guarantee that. But Michelle, one of the issues, I want to just tick through some issues, and particularly some that are of concern to the Committee for Economic Development. But one of the things that is really driving Hillary and that is characterizing her campaign right now, and I'm interested to see how the GOP field deals with it, is essentially the aspirations of women. There is there are two big battles on the kind of civil rights and empowerment front. One is gay LGBT rights, and the other is sort of gender equality, women's rights, breaking through the glass ceiling. Part of that was sort of the momentum in a different dimension with President Obama. It is when Hispanic candidates or Hispanic tilting, and I would put Jeb Bush in that category, are thinking about these things. But how much of this identity dimension is something that we're underplaying in the media right now, Michelle? Because it will have more power than we think it might in a Hillary contest, and those that have to deal with her in the political ring.
Well, this is something that the campaign's been trying to deal with since they kind of dropped the ball last time around. I think everybody kind of thought that they were so busy pitching her as tough that they forgot that people need to relate to her, and they didn't understand kind of the power of the, shattering the glass ceiling thing. That said, it's a tricky line to walk. People have already been asking the Republicans, well, will you be aware on stage that Hillary Clinton is a woman if you're debating her? And kind of, will you have that problem that Rick Lazio had when he seemed to menace her during the debates during her New York
So she can come out and say, I'm a woman, but I promised to bomb a small country quickly?
And somebody mentioned, he's like, I can't imagine she'll be whiny in that context. So it's really this very tricky line they're going to have to walk where they rally the women, but at the same time, you have to keep saying, oh, no, but this isn't about being a woman, this is about being the next candidate. So I think it will be a big part of this, but I don't exactly know how well they're going to manage to handle it.
Margaret?
I think in terms of, I've tried to think about this two ways. I think it's interesting to think about the impact of gender inside the Democratic primary to some extent, because part of what's stopping men in the Democratic Party, either from jumping in or from jumping in more aggressively or differently, is the idea that part of Hillary Clinton's strength or inevitability or whatever you want to call it is because the party is ready for a woman to anoint a woman, right? And I think it's a different calculation on the Republican side. If Hillary Clinton is the nominee, they're going to run against her like they'd run against anybody else. They may be sensitive to gender considerations, depending on how she emerges as a candidate and how she appeals to independents who are women or wobbly male Democratic voters. That will all play into turnout and that sort of stuff. But I think it's a really different calculation inside the Democratic Party than it is inside the Republican Party right now. Republicans running for president don't care that she's a woman; they just want to beat her. And I don't think they primarily think of her as a woman. I think they primarily think about her as the former secretary.
But Republican women are very aware of what they're up against, and they have been working really hard for the last few years. I mean, I've talked to a dozen of them who've started PACs and started outreach groups and started recruiting. And
right.
Everybody's been looking at this with kind of a bit of terror in terms of they're well aware, especially after the last few years with the war on women meme,
Right.
of just how much trouble they're in being seen as a party of old white guys. So they are very aware, but they've also been working really hard to kind of try and figure out what how to correct.
But speaking of white guys, if I could just jump in because he is speaking here in town, John Kasich. Did any of you look at his re-election numbers and the sort of demographics and data? It's remarkable. He doesn't taking that taste test. If you were to take his name out and sort of look at how he won re-election, who supported him, the high degrees of African American support, the fact that the folks across all socioeconomic levels, but particularly lower end, came out in support. What is John Kasich doing that some of his rivals are not? Jeanne?
What I think is remarkable about Kasich is how much he adapted to his early failure. And that is, I think, evidence of being self-confident and being willing to listen to, what the people in Ohio, with the message they were sending to him. That it could, though, be exploited by opponents in a primary campaign. But, after he walked in acting like Scott Walker, going after the unions, he got slapped down very badly by the voters, and he adapted. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what voters want from leaders, and I think they rewarded him for that, and also he also had a really bad Democratic opponent, which is helpful too.
Does that put him in a dark horse position of being the guy that a lot of people weren't talking about, that he becomes the head-scratching possibility?
Yes, he does. You go ahead.
Bob?
You know more.
Yeah, well, he's a good friend. And,
They're all good friends of yours.
Well, but
Any of them not good friends of yours?
Well, there are a couple of them I don't know well. But,
Okay.
But John, I know pretty well. I was his vice chairman when he was chairman of the budget committee, so we go way back in that. And I think that it's absolutely correct that he grew as a chief executive during his first term, and the people of Ohio said, we kind of like what we're seeing here. And the very fact that he carried 86 of 88 counties in Ohio, which is in many ways a microcosm of the country, tells you that there's something there that the general public found attractive.
When you went through, let's take some of the CED issues, and then I've got a nice little roster here. Basically, you can call it the sequester. You could call it about getting reasonable expectations in terms of budget balance. I know you're a budget hawk. Do you think that you're going to see much distinction in the party between different players, Democrat, Republican, or even over these issues of getting the budget back in check? And that means mandated cuts in entitlement programs and those kinds of things. Do you think that will pop as a big issue in this election?
Well, I think where most Republicans are going to be is into the whole subject of growth economics, and that they see the tax structure and the regulatory structures as being the preventative factors in terms of economic growth. And so if you look outward toward balancing the budget, most Republicans are going to say in the course of this campaign that the way to balance the budget is to assure that you have the kind of economic growth that produces revenue off of that growth.
And what you'll see are kind of gradations, like with the Lee Rubio plan, the corporate side of it is quite popular with pro-growth Republicans. The child tax credit and not cutting the marginal top tax rates, not so much, and they've had to answer that. They've done speeches at Heritage, and they've been out on the, trying to kind of rally support for the comprehensive package. So, you'll see a little bit of difference along the way.
The problem, we're in a pretty substantially bad political place on the real big questions of our budget. And why is that? And Bob knows this. You never solve these big questions without a political compromise between both parties. So for one party to go running out there, a la Chris Christie, as much as I think he is brave, to say we're going to take on entitlements, is never in the history of our country worked for one party to say we're going to take all the heat and do this. Ronald Reagan tried that, and he lost a lot of seats in '86 in the Senate. We can go through example after example after example. This is something I actually, having worked for a president, I fault President Obama on. He's in his last year and a half. He ought to lead on this. He ought to get out there and talk about the fact that we have to do something on this. Until the two parties come together and all their names are on the line, we're not going to address this. And by the way, if we don't address this, we're going to be talking about earmarks and shutdowns of a increasingly smaller percent of the federal budget, which is becoming meaningless.
One of the things, I've been thinking about it today with regard to the economy, both thinking about CED, the kinds of checklist of things that one goes through to say, how do you make a strategic leap out of the mess today into something far healthier? So you far healthier for children, far more sensible when it comes to whatever your incarceration policy is, far more honest about the job growth. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me is if you look at, the bounce up in job creation, and you go look at the content of those jobs, we're still 1 million jobs short in the high wage job sector. You're 1 million jobs short from where we were in the medium wage sector. We're pumping up jobs in pizza delivery. I mean, it's great, but we're not producing the high-end jobs. And I'm interested, when you look at that and you ask ourselves, and we're about to have this trade deal, which is controversial. There are debates just recently we had with John Chambers of Cisco and others about the kinds of things that continue to be pro-growth, that the U.S. economy, and what I sort of sense, and I'm wondering whether this presidential election, will finally give us an opportunity to talk about the ecosystem as a whole. What are the kinds of things you need to do, not in the little siloed sliver where there's a lot of vested interest, but the ecosystem as a whole, so that people can have some greater sense that there is an understanding of the synergies between childhood education and your economic outcomes down the road, or pro-growth policies and what you're trying to achieve by way of job creation. Maybe that's too big a question, but it's the kind of question I feel like we ought to be talking about.
We're 15 years into the 21st century, and we're finally come to the realization
that cholesterol's okay.
No, well, true.
Sorry.
But that the solutions, the way in which we solve problems in the 20th century, don't work in the 21st century. That building bureaucracies as solutions to problems is not the way that you actually solve the problems. That the structures that we put in place that created industrial might are not necessarily the same models that you have to have in an information-related economy. And so at some point, the politicians and the parties are going to have to come to the conclusion that there's some fundamental changes that have to be made, and that is not only just in the entitlement area, it crosses the whole spectrum of how we do infrastructure, how we do human capital, all of those questions.
Margaret, you were a Bill Clinton trailer. And tagged along, and Bill Clinton's the last person I can remember who did a decent job of sort of talking about that whole picture from the global to the local.
And as you were talking about this, it just made me think of this speech that I covered when he was at Georgetown earlier this week. It was part of a lecture series. Of course, he wasn't talking about electoral politics. He said from the get-go, nobody believed it. The rows were full of, all of the old hands many of them had been there to hear him speak in 1991 when he did his New Covenant speech, probably had been involved in helping him write it as well. But I think we're going to see this again and again and again over the course of the next year, this question of how much is he just talking about what he believes and what's important to him, and how much is he sort of floating trials about themes maybe that Hillary Clinton will pursue. But he talked about a couple of interesting things, and one was the idea of radical inclusion. Which, depending on how you analyze what that means, could mean broad bipartisan coalitions that try to do things like tackle Social Security reform, or they could mean within the Democratic Party, let's say, trying to figure out all the little nooks and crannies of people to draw in so that you get full turnout. What does he mean? What does she mean? Is she going to talk about radical inclusion? What would her version of radical inclusion look like? And another thing that Bill Clinton talked about was addressed more to the younger students, the Georgetown students who were in the audience, a lot of 18, 19, 20-year-olds, when he talked about the future. And there was some climate change stuff, et cetera, but part of what he was talking about was how technology is transforming labor and the workforce and the economy. And he was talking about experts who have written and talked about this, and the notion that we could be reduced to, let's say, a 3-day work week in all of our lifetimes, which sounds awesome, but...
because robots have picked up the slack?
Right, and less. Yeah. But then what do you do about the not skilled labor force, or even the moderately skilled labor force? The idea that labor would completely transform because it would have to. Not just because it was convenient and you could take 4 days off, but because there would be, this whole just wave of jobs that wouldn't need to exist at all anymore. What would you do and how would you replace them? To figure stuff like that out, obviously you do need some kind of radical inclusion, whether you're talking about people from different parties or whether you're talking about different sectors of society kind of contributing ideas. He was talking about these big things, but at least at this stage in both parties' primaries, we're not really seeing the candidates talk about those kind of things.
Give him a chance.
Yeah, right. I know.
Yeah.
April.
And as much as I felt like the primary debate will be driven by political tactics, I think the general election debate may go to the place you're talking about, Steve, if only because if you look at where we are as a country. We went through presidential cycle where terrorism dominated. Then we go through presidential cycle where the whole economy is going to hell in a handbasket and everybody's just terrified. we've gotten to a place now where there's more stability, so a broader, bigger debate can take place. And I think, every poll we all know shows that this is the debate that the people want.
So
Because they want to know, what the hell are you going to do for me? Because
Right.
they hear these numbers about how corporate America's doing well and the stock market's doing very well, but as we all know, they're not feeling it yet, and they want to have that debate.
So what about the red meat issues? Let's jump into the less earnest issues. But my friend Grover Norquist always said, Steve, the way to, the needles to watch are guns, God, and taxes. So he's got his book out now on how the IRS is going to screw every American. So there's that. You have Bobby Jindal in the New York Times says, holding strong against gay marriage, which is really a marker on religion. We have had an interesting debate. Matt, I think you guys have been part of this in the guns front. How many of those traditional things become dividing lines that matter or check off boxes for kind of loyalty oaths?
Yeah,
and give us some sense of what matters and what's just fluff.
Well, first of all, God, guns, and taxes fails to mention what I think is going to be one of the biggest issues, which is this question of our security. So I think that's really going to
national security will end up being a huge issue.
And Bob knows this, but usually the pocketbook drives the presidential elections. I actually think national security is going to drive this one. But these markers, or whatever we want to call about these issues, I always think it's interesting. So I'm someone who's a pro-life voter. And 20 years ago, the country was more pro-choice than pro-life. Polls have come the pro-life direction. But it's still, it's still a question that's somewhat divided in the country. And a lot of Democrats or moderate Republicans would tell me, you guys got to get off that abortion stuff. You ought to be pro-choice. And you think, in a two-party democracy, when both parties take the same position on issues that are mostly equally divided, guess what happens? You just create a ramp for a new voice or a new political movement to get started. The same thing is true on gay marriage. I keep hearing how this has been decided, and there's no question the momentum is on the side of gay rights and gay marriage. And this poll came out that said 50%.
In about 4 days, right?
So this poll came out that said 50% of Republican primary voters are for gay marriage. They said, so you have to switch your position. Of course, you have to look at the other side of that. 50% of Republican primary voters are for traditional marriage. So I think the tone on these questions is important as we go into the general election, but it would be a disaster for the Republican Party to shed conservative positions on a whole array of issues, including cultural issues. I think they have to handle it and talk about it right, but there are constituencies for these issues. And a democracy like America is big enough and strong enough to have some of these disagreements as a country, yet still be respectful of each other. And I think the Republican Party better tackle those issues that way in this primary, else they will have problems.
Michelle?
Did they break that down? One of the things I mentioned, did they break that down by age? Because my sense is...
Yeah, but the old people vote.
No, that's true. The old people vote, but the younger Republicans overwhelmingly are the ones that are driving that
the
shift
young Republicans
in gay
have broken the
rights.
glass ceiling, as you said earlier. We're seeing these great changes, but the fact is, still, it's a legitimate constituency, right? For
Sure,
folks
it's got to be dealt with. I do think the Rand Paul marijuana position is an interesting one. I was talking to Kasich about this actually, and he's like, he speaks his mind. He's like, why would I think this is a good idea? He's like, why? Great. There's lots of trouble this causes. Why would I come out for this? I mean, if he gets into this race, you will see some. I actually did a big piece urging him to get into the race because I think he will make the debates more interesting on a whole range of things.
I mean, we're going to have a decision this next week, I think, or at least I don't know when decisions come out. I saw Lena Kagan last night. I should have asked her. But the gay marriage decision will be heard this next week in the Supreme Court. It comes down, and I think as best I can tell, I think everybody but Rick Santorum, pretty much, and maybe Mike Huckabee. Is essentially softly opposed to same-sex marriage, but they'd go to a wedding or a reception.
I don't think that's going to be like the ones that that the main contenders are really squabbling over. You're going to see more like in terms of immigration. I think national security is going to be huge.
So talk immigration for a minute. Let's hit on immigration, because one of the other things is the business community we saw on the issue of what had just happened in Indiana. The business community is speaking its mind in very clear ways and in very almost moderate ways, progressive ways. And the business community has been in this get immigration fixed mode. And so you've got this odd thing in my book, I'd love to hear Bob Walker explain it, is the business community seems increasingly at odds with where the GOP leading horses are right now with what they think is vital for them, their companies, and there's a gap. Would you agree there's a gap?
Well, I'm not certain there is, because I think there's a deal to be had on immigration if we had the appropriate leadership. I think the deal begins with border security,
Right.
but it also assures a free flow of labor on green card status and so on
Right.
for people from the Southern Hemisphere primarily, and it assures a path to legality for the people who are here, but not necessarily a path to citizenship. And I think that there is a broad deal that can be had around those things that at some point
They had it. They
That's
passed
the,
it.
but
That's the Senate bill.
Well, but this is what we've been talking about for years, and I think there's a lot of merit to it. But I think it goes back to this question of the types of jobs. The number one reason on the right that this is a problem is because, and I think beyond the right, with a lot of communities, is they just don't think they see the job growth in the domestic economy like they'd like to see. And it has a huge
That's our cover
consequence.
story this month.
Well, I'm giving you a plug.
Came out today. This is our cover just came out today. It says, "Can Starbucks save the middle class?" The upwardly mobile baristas, and what that means. But that is
That
not
is the question. I
high-wage
mean, this
job.
is not an accident, the fact that people feel insecure about the economy. They have grandkids moving in with them because they can't find a job. You have kids who are getting really great educations who can't find a job. And are we surprised that when we say, hey, let's let a bunch of new people in here to compete in the job market, that Americans are smart enough to say, I'm worried about that? That has to get this growth agenda. People have to feel like it's permeated before this is ever going to pass. That's my view.
Well, but that's the reason why it seems to me that the way in which you structure the border security becomes an important part of that. I mean, I think that there would be a more positive reaction if they understood that the only people coming across the border, not to make that
But
absolute,
remember, it's not a border
are
problem.
people who are doing it
But
illegally.
40% of the people who are here illegally are overstaying visas. So we can talk about this border, which is almost impossible
Right.
to make completely secure. It's a bigger question than that. And actually, that's a national security question, too. What I worry about is I agree with you. We ought to find a solution to this. But we're not going to find a solution to it as long as the malaise exists on people's economic outlook.
Margaret, let me ask you just, and then we go to the audience, a loaded question. Do you watch the number of people who hit articles, like the number of clicks you get?
Thank you for that
You-
loaded question.
You do that, right?
That's
Yeah.
good.
So my question is, Bob said national security. What's going on abroad? I was on this morning. There was a report that we had accidentally killed 2 Americans, innocent Americans, and then a non-innocent American in drone attacks. There was also the report that the Iranian supply ships that were going to go arm Houthi rebels most likely pulled back. But what I'm always interested in is you write those stories, and I've noticed it, and I'll just be candid because I have to comment on ISIS and a lot of the beheading issues that are going on, that there seems to be a saturation of interest, in fact, declining interest. And so even though we saw more and more spectacular, shocking theater in the terrorist circles, there seems to be a blasé-ness that is taken over people if it's not truly spectacular. And I'm just sort of interested in whether or not you may be wrong in the sense that while people are worried about the national security, keeping it hyped up so much is something that shifts the minds of Americans. Okay, that's become the new norm. Now let me think about something else. So I'm just provoking you. I mean, so when you write about this stuff, what gets the most hits?
I love foreign policy. I'm really interested in it, so I'm always excited when people care enough about foreign policy that you can tie it to presidential politics, that becomes part of the debate, that it's interesting. Obviously, it's important. But I think it is one thing to say in late April of 2015 that national security, foreign policy is paramount on people's minds, and quite another thing to say what will be driving them to the polls, what will be on their minds in August or September of 2016. And I think, on the Democratic side, the election was all about, change for a while, and back in 2008, and then, in September, all of a sudden the bottom drops out. The old adage about it's the economy, stupid, takes different forms, but just look at what we're talking about now, the way technology is changing the labor markets, the way employment affects people's views toward immigration. This all comes back really to domestic issues in the economy, and you can 100% guarantee that will be at least sharing the spotlight in terms of what drives people to the polls. But I do think that while
I think that's great, by the way.
But in terms of national security, though, look, the landscape has changed a lot since 9/11, and the way Americans think about what national security means is different now than it used to be.
Right.
In the era of Bill Clinton, or even during the run-up to George W. Bush's election. It's permanently changed. It is always, for the foreseeable future now, going to be about how you contend with things,
Right.
With the unknown, with non-state actors, with all this kind of stuff. But whether that will be the number one issue on regular Americans' minds when they go to the polls,
Bob?
I don't know that it'll be the number one issue, but it will be
So what's
a
his number
substantive
two or
issue.
three?
Well, but here's the point: is national security is a much larger question than just foreign policy.
Right.
It goes to the question of, I think Americans have come to the conclusion that leading from behind has not been a very good way to project ourselves into the world. And so, okay, how are you going to project power in the future? That's a subject of military reform, because it may well be that projecting power through carrier task forces is not the way. That what you want to do is have relatively small units that you can move very rapidly into trouble spots in the world.
How about
there are a number of things that have to be done that involve national security that are very different from the way we've thought about it.
How about run the Pentagon at a profit and charge for services?
Well, look, the Pentagon is one of those places where bureaucracy is far too heavy, and where you need to have some substantial reform of how the Pentagon actually conducts its
Steve,
work.
Yeah.
Let me just say, I'll just say quickly, I'll reiterate it. I know we have disagreement here. I'll make the bold prediction. I think national security will be the driving issue in the presidential campaign. I don't think it'll be number 2. I don't think it'll be number 3. I think.
So you want to bet at Denny's breakfast or something?
I want to bet Denny's.
Yeah.
Let's do
Okay,
that.
good.
Well, one of the reasons it'll be at the top is because Republicans want to make it that. And that's the weakness.
No, it's because America wants to make it that. Really,
Well,
it really
that's
is.
it. We've seen the Benghazi investigations. Now we find out that they're going to release the report in 2016 in the run-up to the general. So it will be a big issue, and may have been already, but by design, it will be.